I was told to sign one form, keep my mouth shut, and walk away with my job intact. It was a Tuesday morning in Phoenix, 9:14 a.m., and the coffee in my hand was still too hot to drink. The HR manager slid the paper across the table and avoided my eyes. My husband texted me from the next building. "Just do it. This is how things work." That was when I noticed my access badge had already been deactivated. In that moment, I realized everything I believed about doing the right thing was about to collapse. I was carrying my things out of the building in a cardboard box that still smelled like printer ink when I understood the price of doing the right thing. It was 10:26 a.m. on a Tuesday in Phoenix. The sun was already sharp enough to bounce off the asphalt and hurt my eyes. The parking lot behind the office building looked exactly the same as it had every other morning for the past 6 years. Same faded white lines. Same dented silver Camry 2 rows over. Same palm tree near the handicap spot that never gave any real shade. Nothing about the world had changed, except I no longer belonged in it. The box in my arms was heavier than it should have been. Not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. A framed compliance certificate. 2 binders with handwritten tabs. A ceramic mug that said "World's Okayest Manager." A joke gift from my team after a rough audit year. My access badge lay on top, a thin piece of plastic with my photo and my name, useless now. There was a black line drawn across it with a Sharpie. I did not cry. Not then. I walked slower than usual, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I did not trust my legs yet. Every step felt like I was moving through water. Heavy, delayed, slightly unreal. 10 minutes earlier, I had still been sitting in a conference room on the 3rd floor, the one with the crooked thermostat and the long table that never stopped wobbling. The HR manager had chosen a seat diagonally across from me, not directly opposite. That alone should have told me something. People only do that when they want distance without appearing hostile. She kept her hands folded on the table the entire time. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," she said, reading from a printed sheet. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, like she was explaining a billing error. "This is due to concerns regarding professional conduct and ethical judgment." Ethical judgment. I remember nodding, not in agreement, but out of habit. Years of meetings had trained my body to respond before my mind caught up. I asked one question, the only one that mattered. "Can you be specific?" She hesitated for half a second. Just enough. There were actions taken outside of established reporting channels. I looked down at the paper in front of me. A separation agreement. 2 pages, standard font. No letterhead from legal, which I noticed immediately. My eyes went to the signature line at the bottom. My name was already typed there. "What happens if I don't sign this?" I asked. Her fingers tightened slightly. "Not a lot. Just enough to notice if you were trained to notice small things. This would be in everyone's best interest," she said, "including yours." That was when my phone vibrated on the table. I did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. My husband worked in the operations office across the courtyard. Same company, different building, different world. The vibration stopped, then started again. I flipped the phone face down without checking it. The HR manager followed my movement with her eyes. "If you have questions, you can consult an attorney," she added quickly. "But I do want to be transparent. This decision has already been finalized." Finalized. Another word people use when they want you to stop asking. I signed. Not because I believed I was wrong, not because I was scared of a lawsuit. I signed because something in the room felt off, and I had learned the hard way that when institutions get quiet and polite at the same time, it is never accidental. When I stood up, she did not offer her hand. She simply nodded once and pressed a button under the table. Security appeared almost immediately. Not aggressive, just present, waiting. I remember thinking, absurdly, that they had rehearsed this. Now, standing in the parking lot, that realization finally landed. They had not reacted to me. They had prepared for me. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. "Just do it," my husband had written. "This is how things work. Don't make it worse." I stared at the message longer than I should have. There was no anger in it, no apology either, just instruction, like he was reminding me to lock the door or turn off the stove. I typed nothing back. I placed the box gently into the trunk of my car. The heat inside the metal frame rushed out at me, dry and stale. My steering wheel was already too hot to touch without the sleeve of my blazer. I closed the trunk and stood there for a moment, keys in my hand, unsure of my next move. That was when I noticed the glass doors of the building behind me. From the outside, they looked the same as always, reflective, neutral. But I caught my own reflection in them, small and distorted, holding a box like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. I reached into my pocket out of instinct and pulled out my access badge. I had used it every day for 6 years. Swipe, beep, door open. Today, the black line across it felt heavier than the plastic itself. I did not remember handing it in. That detail bothered me more than it should have. I got into my car and sat there without starting the engine. The air conditioner blasted on automatically, loud in the sudden quiet. My hands were shaking now. Not violently. Just enough that I had to rest them on my thighs to steady them. Across the lot, the operations building stood with its tinted windows and clean lines. I knew my husband was in there, probably in a meeting, probably telling someone that this situation was unfortunate but necessary. I imagined him using the same calm voice he used at home when he explained budgets and timelines. The voice that made everything sound reasonable. A strange thought crossed my mind then, small and sharp. They had deactivated my badge before I signed. I knew this because I remembered using it earlier that morning. 8:02 a.m. It had worked. The system timestamp would show that. And yet, when I looked at the badge now, the line was already there, permanent, certain, which meant the decision had not been waiting on my signature at all. I started the car. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. "Are you okay?" my husband asked. His tone was controlled, almost professional. "I'm fine," I said. My voice sounded unfamiliar to my own ears. Flat, steady. There was a pause on the line, a short one. He filled it quickly. "We'll talk tonight," he said. "There are things you don't see yet." I looked at the road ahead, at the bright blue sky, at the ordinary traffic moving as if nothing had happened. "I see enough," I replied. He did not argue. He simply said my name once, softly, like a warning. We hung up. As I merged onto the highway, it finally became clear to me what had just happened. I had not been fired for breaking the rules. I had been removed because I followed them too closely. And whatever I thought this job was about, whatever I believed my marriage and my work stood for, was about to be tested in ways I had never prepared for. At the time, I still believed the truth would protect me. I did not yet understand how expensive that belief was going to be. Before everything fell apart, my life was not dramatic. That was something I took quiet pride in. I had never chased titles or corner offices. I did not grow up imagining myself as powerful. I wanted to be competent, useful, the kind of person who noticed what others missed and fixed problems before they turned into disasters. That mindset had carried me through college, through my first compliance job, and eventually into the role that would define the next 6 years of my life. I became a compliance manager for a privately owned chain of nursing homes in Arizona because I believed the work mattered. Elder care is not glamorous. It is paperwork, inspections, training sessions that no one wants to attend, and endless reminders about procedures that people think they already understand. But it is also the last line between vulnerable people and neglect. That was how I saw it. That was how I sold it to myself. The company was mid-sized, family-influenced, and constantly preparing for the next phase. That phrase was used a lot. It could mean expansion, a sale, or just another restructuring. No one ever explained it fully, but everyone worked as if it was coming. I liked rules. Not because I was rigid, but because rules made expectations visible. They took guesswork out of morality. Either something met the standard, or it did not. In my world, that clarity was a form of kindness. My husband thought I was too idealistic. We met at a company holiday mixer 6.5 years ago, back when I was still new and he was already considered reliable. He worked operations, which meant he handled logistics, staffing numbers, vendor contracts, and the unglamorous reality of keeping facilities running. We bonded over long hours, mutual exhaustion, and the shared relief of leaving work behind at the same time. He was charming in a quiet way. Not flashy, not romantic in grand gestures. He paid attention, he remembered details. When he asked me out, he suggested a small Mexican place near his apartment because he remembered I hated loud restaurants. I took that as a sign of thoughtfulness. We married 3 years later in a simple ceremony in Sedona. Red rocks, folding chairs, a photographer who kept asking us to laugh on cue. Nothing extravagant. We both agreed we did not want a life built on appearances. When I moved into his house, I noticed how clean everything was. Not obsessively clean, but deliberately so. Surfaces cleared, shoes lined up by the door, pantry labeled. It felt efficient, predictable, safe. That word mattered to me then. At work, my reputation grew slowly. I was not loud in meetings. I asked specific questions. I documented everything. When state inspectors came through, I walked them through processes calmly, without defensiveness. Our facilities passed audits, not because they were perfect, but because we corrected issues before they escalated. People joked that I was by the book. They did not say it kindly. "You know this is elder care, not aerospace," someone once said during a training session, laughing. "We're dealing with humans, not machines." I smiled and responded the way I always did. Exactly. That's why the standards matter. Over time, the jokes turned into comments. Comments turned into suggestions. Maybe I could soften my tone. Maybe I could flag things informally instead of documenting them. Maybe I didn't need to escalate every deviation. I listened. I adjusted where it did not compromise safety. But there were lines I would not cross. I thought that distinction was clear to everyone. At home, my husband supported me in theory. He liked telling people I was the ethical one. It sounded complimentary, but there was something distancing about it, like ethics was a trait I possessed, not a responsibility we shared. When I talked about work, he often reframed my concerns in operational terms. "You have to look at the bigger picture," he would say. "We're already short-staffed. If you push too hard, people will cut corners just to survive." I understood his perspective. I really did. Operations lived in the space between ideal and possible. I respected that. But I believed compliance existed precisely to prevent survival from becoming an excuse. Still, I trusted him. That trust was built on repetition, on shared dinners, on weekends spent grocery shopping and fixing small things around the house. On the way, he brought me water without asking when I stayed up late reviewing reports. On the way, he kissed my forehead absent-mindedly while reading emails. Nothing about our marriage felt fragile. Looking back now, I see the warning signs. But at the time, they blended into the background of a busy life. The first was how often he told me not to worry. Not in a caring way, in a dismissive one. "Don't stress yourself out," he would say when I mentioned an inconsistency. "It's probably already been handled." Handled by whom? I sometimes wondered. But I rarely asked out loud. The second was how frequently he spoke about the company's future in vague, almost reverent terms. "If this sale goes through," he would say, "everything changes." He never specified how, just that it would be good. For us, for everyone. The third was subtler. He stopped asking questions. He used to ask me what I thought about certain policies or inspections. Over time, those questions disappeared. He did not want insight. He wanted reassurance. He wanted me to confirm that things were fine, or at least fine enough. I gave him that reassurance more often than I should have. At work, I noticed changes too. Reports came to me later than usual, sometimes after decisions had already been made. Edits appeared in files I did not remember approving. Small things, easy to explain away. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, I had a good job, a stable marriage, a reputation for integrity. People like that do not suddenly find themselves on the outside. That belief was comforting. Dangerous, but comforting. The morning I was fired, I had woken up like any other day. Showered, dressed, packed my lunch. I had even watered the plant in the kitchen window, the one my husband insisted on keeping alive, even though neither of us was good at it. He kissed me goodbye and reminded me to drive carefully. There was nothing in his tone that suggested what was coming. That was the part that haunted me later, because it meant the version of my life I believed in did not collapse gradually. It existed fully formed right up until the moment it did not. As I drove home that Tuesday morning, the weight of that realization settled in. I had built my sense of safety on routines, on shared assumptions, on the idea that doing my job well was enough. I had believed that rules protected people. I had believed that my marriage was a partnership. I had believed that if something was wrong, I would be told. By the time I pulled into my driveway, those beliefs were already cracking. I just did not know yet how completely they were about to shatter. The first signs did not arrive like warnings. They arrived like inconveniences. A missing signature here. A report submitted a few hours late there. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that demanded an emergency meeting or a raised voice. Just small disruptions to a system that had always run smoothly. I noticed them because noticing things was my job. The first time it happened, I was reviewing a monthly incident log from one of our facilities on the outskirts of Mesa. It was a routine task I could do almost on autopilot. I had read hundreds of these logs before. Same format, same categories, same careful language designed to make minor issues sound resolved and contained. Halfway down the page, something felt wrong. A fall incident had been marked as resolved with no injury, but the follow-up care section was blank. No nurse signature, no timestamp. That was unusual, but not impossible. Sometimes paperwork lagged behind reality. I flagged it and sent a polite email to the facility administrator asking for clarification. An hour later, the log reappeared in my inbox. Same file name, same date, but now the section was filled in, perfectly filled in, too perfectly. The handwriting was uniform, as if copied. The nurse's name was there, but the digital signature metadata showed it had been added after my email. That bothered me. Not because corrections were made, but because no one mentioned them. Normally, when a report was amended, someone explained why. Transparency mattered. This time, there was just silence. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then closed the file and moved on. I told myself it was nothing. A busy administrator, a rushed nurse, not worth escalating. A week later, something similar happened at another facility. This time it was a medication delay. Logged, cleared, no adverse outcome. Again, the follow-up documentation appeared only after I asked for it. I mentioned it casually during a check-in with my husband that evening, while we were making dinner. "Have you noticed reports getting cleaner lately?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He did not look up from the cutting board. "Cleaner how?" "Like things are being fixed after the fact," I said. "Not wrong, exactly. Just late." He shrugged. "People are under pressure. End of quarter. Everyone's scrambling." That explanation made sense. I accepted it because I wanted to. The next sign was smaller. An email thread about staffing ratios disappeared from my inbox. I knew it had been there. I remembered reading it, but when I searched for it later, it was gone. Not archived, not deleted, just missing. I asked IT about it. They told me it must have been a sync issue. I let it go. By then, a pattern had begun to form, though I did not fully recognize it yet. Information was not being withheld entirely. It was being reshaped, smoothed, quietly aligned with decisions that had already been made. The company had started talking more openly about a potential acquisition. Nothing official. Just phrases dropped into meetings. Preparing for due diligence. Presenting a unified picture. Minimizing noise. Noise was their favorite word. Noise was anything that complicated a narrative. I was called into a meeting with senior leadership one afternoon. Not a reprimand, not even a confrontation, just a conversation. The CFO spoke first. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head, relaxed. "You're very thorough," he said. "That's been an asset to this company." I waited. Compliments like that rarely stood alone. But sometimes, he continued, thoroughness can slow things down, especially when we're trying to move forward. I nodded again. out of habit. He smiled. We trust your judgment. We just want to make sure you're applying it strategically. Strategically. That word followed me out of the room. That night, my husband was unusually quiet. He asked about my day, listened, then said nothing for a long moment. You don't need to carry everything alone, he finally said. I know, I replied, but this is literally my job. He sighed. Just don't make enemies where you don't need to. That was new. The next incident involved a patient transfer. An elderly woman was moved from one of our facilities to a hospital late at night. The transfer note was brief, vague, no clear reason listed. When I checked the care timeline, there were gaps, hours unaccounted for. I asked for clarification. The response came not from the facility, but from a regional director. She deteriorated quickly, he wrote. There's nothing more to review. That answer did not sit right with me. Deterioration was rarely sudden without warning, especially not in a controlled environment. I requested additional documentation. This time, my request was ignored. At home, my husband noticed my frustration. You're obsessing, he said gently. You're looking for problems because you expect them to be there. Or, I countered, they're there because I'm looking. He shook his head. You're not seeing the forest. The forest is full of people, I replied. That's the point. We did not argue. We rarely did. But something shifted that night. A thin layer of distance settled between us, almost imperceptible. The final sign before everything broke came in the form of a calendar invite. A compliance review meeting was scheduled without me. I found out by accident when a junior analyst asked me why I had not attended. I wasn't invited, I said, confused. She looked embarrassed. Oh, I thought, never mind. I checked my calendar. Nothing. I checked my email. Nothing. When I asked the organizer about it, he smiled awkwardly. It was more of a preliminary discussion, he said. We didn't want to overwhelm you. Overwhelm me. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the past few months in my mind. Individually, each incident was explainable. Together, they formed something else entirely, a quiet exclusion. I began keeping my own records. Not out of suspicion, I told myself, but out of diligence. I saved copies of reports, took screenshots of timestamps, noted when things changed and when they did not. I did not tell anyone I was doing this. I still believed, foolishly, that if I presented the right information in the right way, things would correct themselves. That clarity would win. The night before the call came at 2:17 a.m. I was organizing files on my laptop when my husband walked past the living room. You're still working? He asked. Just cleaning things up, I replied. He paused, looked at the screen, then walked away without another word. I did not think much of it at the time. I should have. Because by then, the small things I had ignored were no longer random. They were preparation. And I was the variable they were getting ready to remove. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m. Not vibrated. Not buzzed softly against the nightstand. It rang, loud and insistent. The kind of sound that slices straight through sleep and drops you into alertness without transition. For a moment, I did not know where I was. The room was dark, the ceiling fan turning slowly above us. My husband shifted beside me, muttering something I could not make out. I reached for the phone before it could ring again. The number was unfamiliar. Local area code, but not one I recognized. I almost let it go to voicemail. I do not know why I answered. I have replayed that moment 1,000 times since, looking for a reason, instinct, maybe, or habit, or the simple fact that no one calls at that hour unless something is wrong. Hello? My voice sounded rough, pulled out of sleep. There was a pause on the other end. Breathing, shallow, controlled, but strained. Is this the compliance manager? A man asked quietly. Yes, I said, sitting up. This is she. Another pause. Then, my name is Daniel Harris. My mother was a resident at Sunrise Ridge. Sunrise Ridge. The name landed heavily in my chest. Yes, I said again, more carefully this time. How can I help you? He exhaled sharply, like he had been holding his breath. My mother died tonight. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, suddenly wide awake. "I'm very sorry for your loss," I said automatically. Those words were muscle memory. "I can help you connect with—" "That's not why I'm calling," he interrupted. The firmness in his voice made me stop. "They told us she was stable," he continued, "that she'd been checked an hour before she passed, that she'd been given fluids, that she wasn't in distress." My heart began to beat faster. "And?" I asked. "And when we got there," he said, his voice tightening, her lips were cracked, her mouth was dry, her sheets were soaked through, like no one had changed them all day. "Their visit all." I glanced toward the bed. My husband was sitting up now, listening. "They said everything was documented," Daniel went on. "They showed us the chart. It said she'd been hydrated, monitored, cared for." He stopped again. "But my sister took pictures." I closed my eyes. "I'm not accusing anyone," he said quickly, as if he could hear the shift in my breathing. I don't understand. And someone gave her your name." That detail cut through the haze of the conversation. "Who?" I asked. "One of the nurses," he said. "She said if we had questions about the paperwork, we should talk to you, that you were fair." I looked at the clock on the nightstand. 2:23 a.m. "Can you tell me exactly what documentation you were shown?" I asked. He did. Slowly. Carefully. He knew the terms. Intake logs, care rounds, fluid charts. Everything he described sounded correct. Proper, clean, too clean. I asked him to email me the photos. "I can't," he said. "The facility took my sister's phone when she tried to take more." That sentence landed like a physical blow. "They said it violated policy," he added. "They said they'd call the police if she didn't hand it over." I stared at the wall in front of me. My mouth felt dry. "I'm going to look into this," I said. "I can't promise you answers tonight, but I will review the records." He let out a sound that might have been relief. "Thank you," he said. I needed someone to know. I don't first." We hung up. The room felt smaller after that. My husband was watching me closely. "What was that about?" he asked. "A resident death," I replied, choosing my words. "Family has concerns." He nodded slowly. "That happens." "Not like this," I said. He did not respond right away. He swung his legs out of bed and stood, rubbing his face. "Look," he said finally, keeping his voice low. "It's the middle of the night. You can't solve anything right now." "I know," I said, "but I can check the records in the morning." He hesitated. "Maybe you shouldn't." I looked up at him. "Why not?" "Because," he said carefully, "this is exactly the kind of thing that spirals." That word again. "Spirals how?" I asked. He sighed. "Families are emotional. They don't always see the full picture. You start digging, you create expectations." "Or accountability," I said. His jaw tightened. "You don't need to carry this," he said. "Let the facility handle it." "Everyone." I shook my head. "The facility is part of it." The silence between us stretched. "Just be careful," he said at last. "Not everything that looks wrong is wrong." He lay back down, turning away from me. I did not sleep after that. At 7:01 a.m., I logged into the system. The Sunrise Ridge records were immaculate. Care rounds logged every 2 hours. Hydration chart filled in neat increments. Vitals stable. No red flags. No gaps. If I had only seen the records, I would have believed them. Then I checked the timestamps. Multiple entries were logged within seconds of each other, across different residents, by the same staff member. That alone was not impossible, but the pattern repeated. Again and again. Entries created at 11:58 p.m. for care supposedly provided at 8 p.m. Backdated. My stomach tightened. I cross-referenced staff schedules. The nurse listed as providing care had clocked out at 7:42 p.m. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. This was not sloppy documentation. This was fabrication. I took screenshots. Then I checked the camera logs. The hallway footage for that night was missing. Not corrupted. Not partially recorded. Completely overwritten. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. At 9:12 a.m., my phone rang again. This time, it was my husband. Have you looked yet? He asked. Yes, I said. Another pause. And, he prompted. And the records don't match reality, I said. They can't. Decide. His voice dropped. You need to stop. Why? I asked. Because this is bigger than one family, he said. Because people are trying to protect something. Who? I asked. Everyone, he replied. I closed my eyes. Listen to me, he said. If you push this, you won't like where it leads. I'm not pushing, I said quietly. I'm verifying. That's the same thing right now, he snapped, then softened his tone. Please. For once. Let it go. I thought of Daniel's voice on the phone, of cracked lips, of a phone taken away. I can't, I said. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He simply said, Then you're choosing this. The line went dead. At that moment, I still believed there would be a meeting, a review, an internal correction. I did not yet understand that the call at 2:17 a.m. was not the beginning of an investigation. It was the moment I crossed from being useful to being dangerous. We did not talk again until that evening. I came home earlier than usual, my laptop still warm in my bag, my head buzzing with timestamps and screenshots, and the quiet certainty that something had gone very wrong. The house looked the same as it always did. The porch light was on even though it was not dark yet. The front door was locked. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. My husband was already there. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his phone face down, his laptop open but untouched. A glass of water sat near his right hand. He looked up when I walked in, and for a split second, his expression was almost familiar. Concerned, tired. Then it settled into something else. Did you eat? He asked. No, I said, setting my bag down. He nodded, as if that confirmed something for him. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. The silence was not hostile. It was procedural, like a pause built into a process. I talked to Mark today, he said finally. Mark was the regional director, the same one who had dismissed my questions about the transfer. About what? I asked. About Sunrise Ridge, he replied. About the family. I felt a tightening in my chest. And? He exhaled slowly. They're upset. That's understandable. But the documentation is solid. No, it isn't, I said. He looked at me carefully. You think it isn't? I stepped closer to the table. I don't think. I verified. That's exactly the problem, he said. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means, he said, choosing his words with care, that you're looking at this as a compliance issue when it's actually an organizational one. I almost laughed. The words sounded rehearsed. So dehydration is an organizational issue now? I asked. His jaw tightened. You're being dramatic. No, I said. I'm being precise. 80. As to May. He stood up then, slowly, as if sudden movements might escalate things. You're not seeing the full scope. Explain it to me, I said. He rubbed his forehead. We're in the middle of a valuation process. Any disruption right now puts everything at risk. Everything? I asked. Yes, he said. Jobs, facilities, patients. Patients are already at risk, I said. That's the point. He shook his head. You don't need to know every operational detail. The sentence landed hard. I don't need to know? I repeated. You don't need to know everything, he corrected. You need to trust that the system is handling it. I felt something shift inside me then. Slow and unmistakable. I am the system, I said quietly. He looked away. That's not how this works, he replied. I took a breath. Then how does it work? He met my eyes again. Sometimes, he said, things get documented the way they need to be documented. The kitchen felt colder. You're saying the records were adjusted, I said. I'm saying, he replied, that reality is messy, and paperwork is how we keep it from becoming chaos. I could hear my heart in my ears. And the woman who died? I asked. Was she messy too? He flinched. Just barely. That's not fair, he said. What's not fair, I said, is telling a family their mother was cared for when she wasn't. He raised his hand slightly, palms out. You don't know that for sure. Yes, I said. I do." End quote. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression changing in small increments. Calculation, frustration, something harder underneath. "Listen to me," he said. "You're crossing a line." "I crossed it when I took this job," I replied. "No," he said sharply. "You crossed it when you decided you were the arbiter of truth." I took a step back. "That's what compliance is. Not like this," he said. "Not when it threatens everything we've built. It's brages. A providin novelibus nos." We stood there, the weight of that sentence hanging between us. "Everything we've built," I repeated. "You mean the sale?" He did not deny it. "And if this goes to the state?" I asked. His voice dropped. "Then the deal is dead." "And if it goes to Medicare?" I pressed. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. "Then it's catastrophic." "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," he said, "including us." There it was. The word he had been circling all along. Us. "You're asking me to let this go," I said. "I'm asking you to step back," he replied. "Let the right people handle it." "Who are the right people?" I asked. He hesitated. "Legal. The board. Operations." "Not me," I said. He did not answer. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. "You already talked to them," I said. He did not need to confirm it. "They know I'm looking," I continued. "That's why this is happening now." He sighed. "You didn't have to make this personal." I stared at him. "You made it personal when you told me I didn't need to know." He looked tired now, older than I had ever seen him. "You always do this," he said quietly. "You turn principles into ultimatums." "And you always do this," I replied. "You turn harm into logistics." We fell silent again. "I need you to stop," he said finally. "For your own sake." I shook my head. "I can't." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had hardened. "Then you're forcing my hand," he said. My stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that this can't be your fight anymore." I laughed once, short and humorless. "You think you can take it away from me?" "I think," he said, "that you underestimate how these things work." He picked up his phone and slipped it into his pocket. "Go shower," he added, his tone suddenly practical. "You look exhausted." I did not move. "You're not hearing me," I said. "Oh, I hear you," he replied. "I just don't agree." Even Great App did. That night, we slept in the same bed, but it felt like a formality. His back was turned to me. His breathing even. I lay awake, staring into the dark, replaying the conversation again and again. Not the words, but the way he had said them. Calm, certain, as if the outcome was already decided. In the early hours of the morning, I realized something that chilled me more than the argument itself. He was not trying to convince me. He was warning me. By the time I finally drifted into sleep, I understood that whatever protection I thought my marriage offered me no longer existed. I was not standing beside him anymore. I was standing in the way. The next morning, I went to work as if nothing had happened. That decision was not brave. It was instinctive. Routine had always been my armor, and I clung to it even as it began to crack. I dressed carefully, choosing neutral colors, the kind that did not attract attention. I packed my lunch. I fed the plant by the window. My husband had already left by the time I came downstairs. His coffee mug sat in the sink, rinsed and placed upside down, exactly the way he always left it. That detail unsettled me more than his absence. At the office, the air felt different. Not tense, controlled. People smiled when they saw me, but their smiles did not reach their eyes. Conversations stopped a second too early when I walked by. Doors closed more softly than usual. No one confronted me. No one argued with me. They simply adjusted. I logged into my computer. Everything worked. For now. My inbox was full of routine messages, meeting reminders, policy updates. Nothing referencing Sunrise Ridge. Nothing referencing the call. It would have been easy to believe I had imagined the urgency of the night before. At 9:30 a.m., I received a calendar invite. Subject line: Operational Alignment Meeting. No agenda. Mandatory attendance. Attendees included the CFO, legal counsel, 2 board members, and my husband. I stared at the screen for a long moment before accepting. The meeting room was larger than necessary. Glass walls, polished table, a carafe of water no one touched. I took a seat near the end, notebook open, pen in hand. Old habits. They filed in one by one, greeting each other with nods and low voices. When my husband entered, he did not look at me. He took a seat closer to the center. The CFO began. "We're here to ensure alignment," he said, smiling slightly. "There have been some concerns raised, and we want to address them efficiently." Concerns. Not issues. Not violations. Concerns. Legal counsel spoke next. "We've reviewed the documentation related to Sunrise Ridge. From a liability standpoint, there is no actionable exposure at this time." I raised my hand. The room paused. "Yes?" the CFO said. "The documentation was altered after the fact," I said. "The timestamps don't align with staff schedules. The camera footage is missing." Legal counsel did not look surprised. He glanced at the CFO, then back at me. "We are aware of those discrepancies," he said. "They fall within acceptable variance given operational pressures." "Acceptable to whom?" I asked. "To regulators," he replied smoothly, "provided corrective action is taken internally." "And the family?" I asked. The board member across from me leaned forward. "Families interpret situations emotionally," she said. "Our responsibility is to maintain continuity of care." I felt my pen tighten in my grip. "So falsifying records is continuity now?" I asked. My husband finally looked at me. "This isn't about falsification," he said. "It's about context." I turned toward him. "Context doesn't change dehydration." A silence settled over the room. Not awkward, deliberate. The CFO cleared his throat. "We're not here to debate clinical outcomes," he said. "We're here to manage risk." Risk. That word reframed everything. They were not discussing what happened. They were discussing how it would be perceived, how it could be contained, how it might affect valuation. Sunrise Ridge was not a tragedy to them. It was a variable. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to push back, for someone to acknowledge the human cost. No one did. Instead, legal counsel turned to me. "Your diligence is appreciated," he said, "but we need to recalibrate your role in situations like this." "Recalibrate how?" I asked. He folded his hands. "You have a tendency to escalate prematurely." Prematurely. I almost laughed. "I was contacted directly by the family," I said. "That's not escalation. That's response." The board member shook her head gently. "That was inappropriate on their part." "So is withholding care," I replied. My husband exhaled sharply. "This is exactly what I meant," he said. "You're personalizing this." I stared at him. "You're professionalizing it." The CFO raised his hand. "Enough," he said. "We're not going to resolve this by arguing semantics." He turned toward me. "Going forward, any concerns of this nature should be routed through operations." I felt a cold realization settle in. "That bypasses compliance," I said. "Yes," he replied. "Why?" I asked. "Because," he said calmly, "your involvement introduces unpredictability." Unpredictability. In that moment, I understood something fundamental. There was no villain in the room, no mastermind, no single person pulling strings in the shadows. There was a system that rewarded smooth outcomes and punished disruption. Each person at that table believed they were acting responsibly, ethically even. They were protecting jobs, facilities, investments. They were protecting themselves. My husband was not betraying me in the dramatic sense. He was aligning with incentives, choosing stability over truth, predictability over accountability. I closed my notebook. "If I follow this directive," I said, "what happens to Sunrise Ridge?" The CFO smiled. "It will be addressed internally." "And the family?" I asked. "They will be managed," he said. "Managed. Like noise." I stood up slowly. "I can't agree to this." No one looked shocked. The CFO sighed. "Then we have a problem." My husband looked at me then, his expression unreadable. "Sit down," he said quietly. I shook my head. "I can't." Legal counsel spoke. "This is becoming adversarial." Quote, "No," I said. "This is becoming clear." I gathered my things and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. That was the most telling part. Outside the conference room, the hallway felt longer than usual. My phone buzzed almost immediately. A text from my husband. "You're making this worse." I did not respond. Back at my desk, I found my access to certain folders restricted. Not all, just enough to slow me down, to remind me of my place. I sat there, staring at the screen, and finally allowed myself to name what I was facing. I was not fighting corruption. I was fighting consensus. A quiet agreement that harm was acceptable if it served a larger narrative, that ethics were flexible under pressure, that compliance was a suggestion, not a boundary. By the end of the day, I knew something else too. If I continued, they would not argue with me again. They would remove me, and my husband would let them. Because in a system like this, loyalty was not personal. It was structural. They did not fire me immediately. That came later, wrapped in procedure and polite language. What happened first was quieter, and in many ways, more devastating. They erased me. The morning after the meeting, my access still worked, but only partially. Certain folders no longer opened. Internal dashboards loaded without historical data. Automated reports arrived, stripped down, missing the layers I needed to do my job properly. No one told me this was intentional. When I asked IT, they blamed system updates. When I asked my supervisor, he said he would look into it. When I asked legal, they redirected me to operations. When I asked operations, they told me to submit a request in writing. Every path led to delay. By the third day, it was obvious what was happening. I had not been removed from my role on paper, but I had been stripped of its function. I was still employed, still salaried, still expected to show up, but I could no longer see the full picture. It was compliance theater. I started documenting again, but this time with a different understanding. I was not collecting evidence to fix a problem. I was collecting proof that I was being sidelined. That distinction changed everything. At home, the atmosphere shifted just as quietly. My husband became careful with his words. He did not lie outright. He simply avoided specifics. When I asked how work was going, he gave broad answers. When I mentioned Sunrise Ridge, he changed the subject. We still ate dinner together, still shared a bed, but the conversations that had once felt like partnership now felt like negotiations. One evening, while we were clearing dishes, he said, "You need to think about your future." I looked at him. "I am." "No," he said. "Your career, your reputation." That word made my stomach drop. "What about it?" I asked. He hesitated. "This industry is small." I waited. "If your name gets associated with instability," he continued, "people remember that." "Instability," I repeated, "or accountability." He did not answer. That was the moment I realized what they were truly taking from me. Not my job, my credibility. In healthcare compliance, your reputation is everything. It follows you quietly, through references and informal conversations. You are either trusted or you are not. Once that trust is questioned, doors close without explanation. They knew that. They were not trying to punish me publicly. They were making me radioactive. At work, I noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with me. Invitations stopped coming. Decisions were made without my input. When I entered rooms, conversations shifted, topics. One afternoon, a junior analyst stopped by my desk, hovering awkwardly. "I just wanted to say," she began, lowering her voice, "I'm sorry." "For what?" I asked. She glanced around. "They told us not to loop you into anything sensitive anymore." I nodded. "Thank you for telling me." She lingered. "You're not wrong, you know." I met her eyes. "Be careful." She swallowed and walked away. That night, I opened my personal email and found a message from HR. Subject line: Professional Conduct Review. The language was careful, vague. It referenced concerns raised regarding adherence to internal escalation protocols and potential conflicts of interest. This starred and rhyme. Conflicts of interest. I read it 3 times, feeling a cold, steady anger settle in. They were building a narrative, one where I was not principled, but reckless, not ethical, but emotional. Not protective, but disruptive. I forwarded the email to my personal archive and closed my laptop. In the bedroom, my husband was scrolling on his phone. "They're preparing to make this official," I said. He did not look up. "I know." The admission stung. "You know?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "This isn't sustainable." "For whom?" I asked. He sighed. "For anyone." I sat on the edge of the bed. "You're okay with this?" He looked at me then, really looked at me. "I'm trying to protect us." "By sacrificing me?" I asked. "That's not fair," he said. "No," I replied. "It's accurate." He rubbed his temples. "You're acting like they're stealing something from you." "They are," I said. He shook his head. "You still have your skills, your experience. No one can take that." "I find," I laughed softly. "That's not how this works." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward. "They don't need to disprove me. They just need to make me inconvenient." Silence filled the room. "They're not taking my paycheck," I continued. "They're taking my ability to ever do this work again." He looked away. "And you're letting them," I said. He stood abruptly. "I'm not your enemy." "No," I said quietly. "You're just not on my side." It refrained. The next week, I was formally placed on administrative leave. The meeting was brief, respectful. The HR manager I had met before slid another document across the table. "This is standard," she said. The leave was paid. Temporary. Pending review. On paper, it looked generous. In reality, it was exile. My badge was deactivated that afternoon. My email access revoked. My name removed from internal directories. I drove home in silence, the radio off, my hands steady on the wheel. At home, I opened my laptop and began researching job postings. Compliance manager, senior compliance analyst, regulatory affairs. I applied to 3 positions that night. 2 weeks later, I received polite rejections. One recruiter called me directly. "You're very qualified," she said, "but there are concerns." "What kind of concerns?" I asked. She hesitated. "About fit." Fit. The safest word for distrust. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. They had not just removed me from a job, they had removed my voice from the system. That was the real punishment. And in that moment, a painful truth became impossible to ignore. I could walk away quietly, protect what little remained of my career, and let the narrative settle. Or I could accept that my professional life, as I knew it, was already over, and decide what to do with that fact. The choice was no longer about compliance. It was about who I was willing to become when everything I had worked for was taken from me without a single accusation being proven. And for the first time since the call at 2:17 a.m., I stopped trying to preserve my place in their world. I started thinking about how to expose it. Once I was placed on administrative leave, the company assumed I was finished. That assumption was not malicious. It was procedural. People like me, once isolated, were expected to retreat, to protect what little remained of our professional identity, to consult attorneys, draft careful statements, and wait for outcomes that had already been decided elsewhere. They expected fear. What they underestimated was habit. For 6 years, my job had been to read systems the way other people read stories. Not just what was written, but how it was written. When entries appeared, from where, in what sequence. Compliance was never about one document. It was about patterns, and patterns leave traces. Even after my access was restricted, I still had something they could not revoke: my training. And I had something else they had forgotten about entirely: data that was technically correct, but operationally damning. It started with an old laptop. I had kept it in the hall closet, wedged behind a box of winter clothes we never needed in Arizona. It was the device I had used during the company's transition to a new care management platform 3 years earlier. Back then, IT had instructed us to retain local copies of system training datasets in case the rollout failed. The rollout never failed, so no one ever asked for the files back. I powered the laptop on and waited. It took longer than I remembered, the fan whining softly as if protesting being woken from a long sleep. When the desktop finally appeared, I opened the folder labeled CMS, Training, Archive. There it was. A static snapshot of the system's original architecture. No patient names, no protected health information, just structure, fields, metadata rules, time-stamping logic, user permission hierarchies, the bones of the machine. I spent hours going through it, cross-referencing what I remembered from live operations with what the system was designed to do. And slowly, something began to crystallize. The platform recorded more than what most users ever saw. Every entry care provided, medication administered, vitals check generated multiple timestamps. Not just the visible one on the chart, but back-end markers, creation time, modification time, device origin, and network point of entry. Those markers were not editable through the front-end interface, which meant something important. If someone wanted to falsify records convincingly, they could change what appeared on the surface, but they could not fully erase how the system remembered it had been changed. I sat back in my chair, heart beating faster. This was not evidence in the cinematic sense. No smoking gun, no dramatic revelation. It was worse than that. It was boring, and boring was powerful. I logged into my personal email and opened the screenshots I had taken weeks earlier, before my access was cut. Timestamps, staff IDs, entry sequences. I began recreating timelines. At Sunrise Ridge, care rounds were documented in uniform blocks 8 p.m., 10 p.m., midnight. But the back-end data told a different story. Entries supposedly made by 3 different nurses were all created within a 90-second window, from the same terminal, using the same login credentials. No human being could do that. Not honestly. I cross-referenced staff schedules I had saved locally. The nurse assigned to that wing had clocked out before the entries were made. The system knew that. It recorded the login origin as a workstation in the administrative office, not the care wing. Someone had sat at a desk and filled in the past. I kept going. It was not just Sunrise Ridge. 2 other facilities showed similar patterns, though less severe. Late entries, batch modifications, the same administrative terminals, the same credentials used after hours. This was not a rogue employee covering mistakes. This was process. My hands were steady as I worked, but my chest felt tight. The scope of what I was seeing was larger than I had anticipated. This was not about one death. It was about how the company managed reality when reality threatened its narrative. I thought of the meeting, of the CFO's calm voice, of legal counsel's smooth reassurances. They were not ignorant. They were informed. At some point, I became aware that my phone had been buzzing repeatedly. I ignored it until the screen went dark again. Then I checked. 3 missed calls. All from my husband. A text followed. "We need to talk. Now." I did not respond. For the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. Whatever conversation he wanted to have was no longer relevant. The truth did not need his permission. Still, I moved carefully. I did not print anything. I did not forward files. I did not label folders with anything dramatic. I treated the information the way I had always treated sensitive data, methodically, quietly, with respect for process. By early morning, I had compiled a report, not an exposé, not a manifesto, a compliance analysis. It outlined system behavior, documented discrepancies, explained, in plain language, how back-end metadata contradicted surface-level records. It did not accuse individuals. It did not speculate motive. It simply showed that the records could not be trusted as accurate representations of care. I read it 3 times, editing for tone. No emotion, no outrage, just facts. When I finished, I sat back and stared at the document, suddenly aware of how much had changed. A month ago, I would have routed this internally, escalated through proper channels, trusted the system to correct itself. That option was gone. The system had already told me where it stood. I closed the file and opened a new browser window. Medicare audits were not handled by company compliance departments. They were handled by independent reviewers, bound by federal mandate. They had jurisdiction. They had teeth. They also had protocols. I found the reporting guidelines easily. public, transparent, no drama. I began formatting my report to match them. That was when my phone rang again. "This time," I answered. "What are you doing?" my husband asked. His voice was tight. "Working," I said. "You need to stop," he said. "This is going too far." I looked at the report on my screen. It already went too far. "You don't understand what this will do," he said. "I understand exactly what it will do," I replied. "It will slow them down." "Slow them down?" he repeated incredulously. "You're talking about federal oversight." "Yes," I said. "I am." There was silence on the line. "You're burning everything," he said finally. "No," I replied. "I'm documenting it." "And that won't protect you," he said. "I know," I answered. Another pause. "Then why?" he asked. I thought of Daniel Harris, of cracked lips, of a phone taken away. "Because someone needs to," I said. He exhaled sharply. "If you do this, there's no coming back." I closed my eyes. "I already didn't come back," I said. We hung up. When I submitted the report, there was no fanfare, no confirmation email, just an automated acknowledgement that my materials had been received and would be reviewed. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling strangely calm. They had taken my job. They had taken my reputation. They had taken my place inside the system. But they had not taken my understanding of it. And that, it turned out, was the one thing they should have been afraid of. Because once you see how a system hides its damage, you can never unsee it. And once you know where the truth is stored, it does not matter how many doors they lock. The system remembers. Nothing happened at first. That was the part I was least prepared for. I had braced myself for retaliation, for legal threats, for some kind of immediate consequence that would confirm I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Instead, there was silence. Days passed. Then a week. No emails. No phone calls from auditors. No letters from lawyers. The world continued with its ordinary indifference. The sun still rose early over Phoenix. The grocery store still played the same soft music in the aisles. My phone remained quiet. At home, the silence took on a different quality. My husband stopped pretending nothing was wrong. He no longer asked how my day was. He no longer commented on the news playing quietly in the background. He moved through the house with a careful distance, as if the space between us had become something fragile that might shatter if touched. One evening, he broke the silence. "They've suspended the sale," he said, not looking at me. I paused in the doorway. "What?" "The acquisition," he clarified. "It's on hold." I felt a flicker of something in my chest. Not satisfaction. Recognition. "Why?" I asked. He hesitated. "Due diligence issues." I nodded slowly. "Medicare?" He did not answer. That was confirmation enough. Over the next few days, the effects began to ripple outward. Subtle at first, a facility-wide audit announced, without explanation. Requests for documentation that had never been requested before. Staff interviews scheduled with little notice. None of it made the news. None of it needed to. In healthcare, when federal oversight arrives quietly, everyone feels it. Executives stop smiling as much. Meetings get shorter. Decisions are postponed. Cash flow projections become conservative. The company did not collapse. It froze. At work, my husband's hours grew longer. He came home later each night, his phone glued to his hand. When he did speak, it was clipped, defensive. "They're overreacting," he said once, pacing the living room. "This is all procedural." I watched him carefully. "Procedures matter," I replied. He stopped pacing. "Don't say it like that." "Like what?" "Like you're right," he snapped. I said nothing. The call from Medicare came 2 weeks later. It was not dramatic. A calm woman introduced herself, confirmed my identity, and asked if I was available to clarify a few points in my submission. We spoke for 20 minutes. She asked precise questions. I gave precise answers. No speculation, no emotion. At the end, she thanked me. "Your report was thorough," she said. "That's appreciated." When the call ended, I sat there, phone in my hand, aware of how understated the moment was. This was not justice in the cinematic sense. There were no raised voices, No declarations of wrongdoing, just process. Over the next month, the consequences became harder to ignore. Medicare payments to several facilities were temporarily suspended pending review. Not denied, suspended. That distinction mattered. It created uncertainty, and uncertainty was poison to valuation. The board scheduled emergency meetings. Consultants were brought in. Legal fees ballooned. Still, no one was arrested. No charges were filed. The company adapted, as systems always do. At home, the adaptation was more personal. My husband grew increasingly volatile. Not violent, not overtly cruel, just brittle. "This didn't have to happen," he said one night, his voice raw. "You could have trusted me." I met his eyes. "I trusted you," he laughed bitterly. "No, you didn't." "Yes," I said. "I trusted you to tell me the truth. You chose not to." He shook his head. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." "I do," I replied. "I just didn't agree with how you handled it." That distinction infuriated him. "You think you're some kind of hero," he said. "No," I said. "I think I was a witness." He stared at me. "And what did it cost you?" I did not answer immediately. My career was stalled. My name whispered about cautiously. Recruiters no longer called. Invitations dried up. It had cost me everything I had built professionally. And yet, when I thought about Daniel Harris, about the night he had called, I felt no regret. "I lost my job," I said finally. "I lost my standing. I may never work in compliance again." He waited, almost triumphant. "But I didn't lose myself," I added. He scoffed. "That doesn't pay the mortgage." "No," I agreed. "But it lets me sleep." The argument that followed was not loud. It was clinical. We discussed finances, options, what separation would look like if it came to that. The word divorce was not spoken, but it hovered between us. A week later, he told me he was being reassigned. Not fired, reassigned. A demotion, framed as a strategic realignment. Less authority, less influence. A career plateau. "They're distancing themselves," he said bitterly. "Yes," I replied. "That's how systems protect themselves." He looked at me with something like disbelief. "You talk about this like it's abstract." "It is," I said. "Now, it is only fined." The Medicare review continued quietly in the background. Recommendations were issued, corrective action plans mandated, new oversight requirements imposed. Sunrise Ridge implemented mandatory hydration monitoring protocols. Staff training increased. Documentation procedures tightened. On paper, things improved. No apology was ever issued to the family. Daniel Harris never called again. I did not reach out to him. That was not my role. One afternoon, I received an email from the Medicare auditor I had spoken with. The subject line was simple: "Review update." The body was shorter. "Your cooperation was valuable. The review has concluded. Appropriate actions have been taken." That was it. No validation. No acknowledgement of cost. Just closure. I sat there, staring at the screen, feeling an unexpected emptiness. I had imagined, at some point, that there would be a moment where it felt worth it, where the scale would tip visibly toward justice. Instead, there was this: quiet correction, partial accountability, and a personal aftermath no one else would ever see. That night, my husband packed a bag. "I need space," he said. I nodded. "So do I." When the door closed behind him, the house felt eerily still. Not lonely, just quiet. In that quiet, I understood something essential. The system had responded exactly as designed. It absorbed the disruption, adjusted its processes, and moved on. It did not thank me. It did not protect me, but it did change. And in that change, imperfect and incomplete as it was, I found something I had not expected. Not victory, but truth. And that, it turned out, was enough to begin again. If I had believed in simple endings, this would have been the moment where everything collapsed. A headline. A public scandal. Executives escorted out of glass buildings with cardboard boxes like mine. That was the story arc people expect when wrongdoing is exposed. That was not what happened. The company did not fall. It adjusted. From the outside, the changes looked almost responsible. Press releases spoke of enhanced oversight and renewed commitment to patient care. New consultants were introduced. A revised compliance framework was announced. The language was clean, optimistic, forward-looking. Inside, the effect was more subtle. Decisions slowed, emails multiplied, meetings became shorter and more frequent, as if breaking conversations into smaller pieces could contain risk. People began to speak in disclaimers. No one said anything without first stating what they were not saying. It was not panic. It was control. I heard about most of this secondhand, through former colleagues who reached out cautiously, as if association with me might still carry consequences. "They're locking everything down," one of them told me over coffee, her voice low. "Nothing moves without 3 approvals now." "That's what oversight looks like," I said. She studied my face. "Do you regret it?" I thought for a moment. "I regret that it was necessary." That answer surprised even me. The suspension of Medicare payments had not lasted long enough to make headlines, but it had lasted long enough to scare the board. Cash flow interruptions, even temporary ones, had a way of clarifying priorities. The planned acquisition was postponed indefinitely. Investors grew cautious. Valuations were quietly revised downward. No one announced these things publicly. They did not need to. Inside the company, people felt it. Budgets tightened. Hiring froze. Projects that had once been fast-tracked were suddenly deemed non-essential. My husband felt it most acutely. He called me one evening, his voice strained. "They're restructuring operations," he said. Again. I listened. "They're breaking up responsibilities," he continued. "Splitting authority. No one's in charge of anything anymore." "That's intentional," I said. "Distributed risk." He laughed without humor. "You talk like this is a case study." "It is," I replied. "You're just inside it." There was a pause. "They don't trust me anymore," he said quietly. The words landed heavier than anything he had said before. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. He exhaled sharply. "No, you're not." I did not argue. In the months that followed, the company settled into its new shape, less ambitious, more cautious, slower. It survived, which was all it had ever really wanted. The facilities continued operating. Residents continued living their lives within those walls. Staff continued showing up, now burdened with additional documentation requirements that no one thanked them for. From a distance, it looked like progress. From closer up, it looked like adaptation. I watched all of this from the outside, my own life reorganizing itself in parallel. I stopped applying for compliance roles. The rejections had not been overt, but they had been consistent. Phrases repeated themselves. Not the right fit. Concerns about alignment. We're pursuing other candidates. I recognized the pattern, so I stopped feeding it. Instead, I took short-term consulting work, training sessions, policy reviews for smaller organizations that could not afford full compliance departments. I spoke carefully. I documented everything. I avoided industry gossip. I became invisible by choice. At first, that invisibility felt like failure. I had spent years building a professional identity, only to watch it dissolve quietly. But over time, something unexpected happened. The silence gave me room. I slept better. My thoughts slowed. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, searching for alternate outcomes. One afternoon, while reviewing materials for a small assisted living facility, I realized I was smiling. The owner sat across from me, earnest and overwhelmed. "I just want to do this right," she said. "I don't want to hurt anyone." I believed her. That belief mattered. At home, the space my husband had vacated began to feel less like absence and more like clarity. We spoke occasionally, usually about logistics. The emotional arguments had burned themselves out. One evening, he asked me directly, "Was it worth it?" I did not answer immediately. "I lost my job," I said slowly. "I lost my standing. I lost my marriage, if we're being honest." He waited. "But I gained something too," I continued. "I gained certainty." "About what?" he asked. "About who I am," I replied. He said nothing. We did not reconcile. As the year drew to a close, I received one final update from a former colleague. "They've closed the Sunrise Ridge file," she said. Officially. I nodded. What did they conclude? She hesitated. That procedures were insufficient, that corrective actions were taken. And responsibility? I asked. Another pause. Diffuse. It's process. Of course it was. I thanked her and hung up. That night, I sat on my porch and watched the sky darken over Phoenix, the heat finally easing as the sun disappeared. The world felt quieter than it had in a long time. I thought about the woman at Sunrise Ridge, about her family, about the documentation that had tried to erase her final days. I thought about how the system had responded not with justice, but with adjustment. And I understood something that had taken me a long time to accept. Systems do not exist to be fair. They exist to endure. Fairness is a side effect, not a goal. I had once believed that exposing the truth would force a reckoning. What it had done instead was force a recalibration. The machine had absorbed the shock and continued on, slightly altered, slightly more careful. It was not enough. But it was not nothing. The company did not fall. It bent. And in bending, it revealed its shape more clearly than it ever had before. I stood up from the porch, feeling the weight of that understanding settle into something solid. My life was smaller now, less impressive, less protected, but it was also mine. And for the first time since the phone rang at 2:17 a.m., I did not feel like I was bracing for impact anymore. I felt like I was choosing direction. The system had done what systems always do. Now it was my turn. People assume that after something like this, there is a moment of triumph, a call, a letter, an acknowledgement that what you did mattered. I waited for that moment longer than I should have, even after I told myself I was not waiting for anything at all. It never came. There was no official vindication, no apology from the company, no quiet message from someone high up admitting I had been right. The system corrected itself just enough to survive and then sealed the gap behind it, leaving me on the outside with my certainty and very little else. For a while, that felt like failure. I would wake up in the early hours of the morning, the house still dark, and replay the sequence of events in my head as if there might be an alternate version I had missed. A different tone I could have used, a different meeting I could have requested, a different compromise that might have kept me inside the structure without losing myself entirely. But every version ended the same way. Someone would still have died without proper care. Records would still have been adjusted, and I would still have been asked to look away. That was the line I could not uncross, no matter how many times I tried to imagine it differently. I began teaching part-time almost by accident. A small assisted living association reached out after a training session I had led. They asked if I would consider developing a short ethics and compliance course for new administrators. Nothing formal, nothing branded, just practical guidance. I hesitated. Teaching felt like a step backward. I had spent years operating inside complex systems, shaping policy, managing risk at scale. Standing in front of a small group with a whiteboard felt diminished, but I agreed. The first class met in a rented conference room above a strip mall. Folding chairs, burnt coffee. 10 people who looked tired in a way I recognized immediately. I did not lecture. I told them stories, not dramatic ones, ordinary ones, the kinds of situations they would actually face. Staffing shortages, documentation pressure, families who asked too many questions, supervisors who wanted things to look better than they were. I watched their faces as recognition set in. Afterward, one woman stayed behind. "I've never heard anyone talk about this out loud," she said. "Usually they just tell us to follow policy." I nodded. "Policy is easy. Judgment is harder." She looked at me carefully. "What happens if you don't?" I thought of the cardboard box, the parking lot, the quiet erasure. "You lose things," I said, "but you keep others." That answer stayed with me. Over time, the teaching grew. More sessions, more invitations, nothing prestigious, nothing that came with a title or benefits, but something else came instead. People listened. They asked questions that were not about avoiding liability, but about responsibility, about what to do when the rules conflicted with reality, about how to recognize when compromise had crossed into harm. I never told them what to choose. I told them what it would cost. At home, my life simplified. The house felt different without my husband's presence. Not emptier, just quieter. The routines that had once been shared became singular. I rearranged the kitchen, gave away the plant we had kept alive out of stubbornness rather than affection. We finalized the divorce without drama. No accusations, no courtroom battles, just paperwork and the mutual understanding that whatever we had been building no longer existed. He asked me once, during the process, "Do you think I'm a bad person?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "I think you made a choice you could live with." "And you?" he asked. I made one I couldn't avoid. That was the last personal conversation we had. As the months passed, I stopped introducing myself by my former title. I stopped explaining my background unless it was relevant. I learned how freeing it could be not to anchor my identity to an institution that could discard it so easily. Still, there were moments of doubt. At conferences, when I saw former colleagues speaking on panels, when I read industry newsletters filled with familiar names, when I wondered what my career would have looked like if I had stayed quiet, those thoughts came less often with time. One afternoon, after a particularly long training session, I sat alone in my car and realized something that surprised me. I was not angry anymore. I did not feel righteous, or bitter, or proud. I felt clear. The clarity did not come from winning. It came from accepting that I had never been playing a game designed for fairness. I had been participating in a system that measured success by continuity, not conscience. Once I stopped expecting that system to reward integrity, the disappointment lost its power. People sometimes asked me if I would do it again. I always paused before answering. "Yes," I said finally, every time. But not because it worked. "Then why?" they asked. "Because it was mine," I replied. That answer confused some people. Others understood immediately. Late one evening, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was from Daniel Harris. He wrote briefly. He said his family had moved on as best they could, that they never received an apology, but that the facility had changed its practices, that he did not know if it was because of me, but that someone had finally listened. He thanked me for answering the phone that night. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I did not explain what it had cost me. I did not justify my choices. I simply wrote back, "I'm glad someone did something." After I sent it, I felt something loosen inside my chest. I had spent so long measuring outcomes in institutional terms that I had forgotten the scale that mattered most. I did not win. I did not restore my career. I did not dismantle the system. I did not emerge unscathed. But I did not apologize either. I did not retract the truth to make others comfortable. I did not reframe harm as inconvenience. I did not agree to forget. In a world that rewards silence more reliably than integrity, that choice mattered. Not because it changed everything, but because it changed me. And when I stood in front of those small rooms, those tired faces, and told them what the line actually looked like when you reached it, I knew something with a certainty that no institution could take away. There are many ways to survive. Not all of them are worth the cost. And sometimes, refusing to win on someone else's terms is the only honest ending there is. The room was quiet in the way only borrowed spaces ever are. It was a small classroom attached to a community center on the edge of town, the kind of place that hosted tax workshops in March and grief counseling on Tuesday nights. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead. A whiteboard leaned against the wall, permanently stained with the ghosts of past lessons. I arrived early, as I always did. I placed my bag on the table, arranged the handouts in neat stacks, and checked the time on my phone. 6:42 p.m. People would start arriving soon, carrying their own versions of exhaustion with them. Some would be administrators, some nurses, some owners who had inherited small facilities they never intended to run. None of them knew my old title. That was intentional. When the first woman walked in, she smiled politely and chose a seat near the back. A man followed, then another. They nodded at me but did not ask questions. They did not look impressed. They did not look wary. They looked relieved. When the room was full, I closed the door and stood at the front, hands resting lightly on the table. "I'm not here to teach you how to avoid citations," I began. "I'm here to talk about what happens when the rules stop protecting the people they were written for." No one interrupted. I did not tell them my story all at once. I did not need to. Pieces of it surfaced naturally as we talked through scenarios. A missed care round, a supervisor who suggested cleaning up, a report, a family who asked questions that made everyone uncomfortable. I watched recognition move through the room, quiet and unmistakable. At the end of the session, no one applauded. They never did. Instead, they lingered. They asked practical questions. They shared small confessions. One man stayed behind after everyone else had left. "I've been in this field 20 years, he said. No one ever told me where the line actually was. I wiped the board slowly. "They don't like to talk about lines," I said. "They prefer gray areas." He nodded. "What do you do when you reach it?" I turned to face him. "You decide what you're willing to lose." He thanked me and left. I locked the door behind him and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet return to the room. The hum of the lights, the distant sound of traffic, the ordinary world continuing on. As I drove home, the sky stretched wide and dark above the desert, stars faint but present. I rolled down the window and let the air move through the car. It smelled like dust and heat and something clean underneath. My life was smaller now. I lived alone in a modest place, no longer chosen for proximity to an office or a commute. I worked contract to contract, session to session. There were no benefits, no titles, no ladder to climb, but there was something else. I slept through the night. I did not wake to the sound of a phone ringing with news I could not unhear. I did not carry the weight of decisions I had agreed to against my better judgment. I did not rehearse explanations for things I knew were wrong. When I passed a nursing home now, I did not avert my eyes. I thought about the woman at Sunrise Ridge less often than I once had. Grief, I learned, does not fade evenly. It recedes and returns. But when I did think of her, it was no longer with the sharp panic of responsibility. I had done what I could. Not everything. Not enough to fix the world, but enough to refuse to become part of the harm. That mattered. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what my life would have looked like if I had stayed, if I had signed the agreement without question, if I had let the documentation smooth itself over and trusted the system to absorb the damage. I imagined the promotions, the security, the sense of belonging, and then I imagined the cost. I imagined sitting in rooms where everyone spoke carefully and no one said what they meant. I imagined watching the same patterns repeat, only more quietly. I imagined teaching myself to look away just enough to survive. The image never held. There are ways to win that feel like erasure. I had chosen not to win that way. On a Sunday morning, months after everything had settled, I cleaned out the last box from my old career. Old binders, outdated manuals, a certificate I no longer needed. At the bottom, I found my access badge. The black line was still there, permanent and unyielding. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the smooth plastic, the faded photo. For a moment, I considered throwing it away. Instead, I placed it back in the box and closed the lid, not as a souvenir, as a reminder. I had once believed that doing the right thing would protect me, that institutions rewarded integrity if you followed their rules closely enough, that marriage meant standing on the same side of difficult truths. I was wrong, but I was not naive anymore. That belief had fallen apart, yes, but in its place, something sturdier had formed, a quieter understanding of how power works, of how systems prioritize themselves, of how easily harm can be reframed as necessity, and of how much choice still remains, even when options narrow. When people ask me now what happened, I keep it simple. I left, I say, not because I was forced out, but because I saw clearly where staying would lead. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing you did not trade your name for safety or your silence for belonging. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles in slowly, like dust after a storm. That night, I stood on my porch and watched the lights of the city flicker on in the distance. Lives unfolding behind walls I would never enter. Decisions being made in rooms I would never see. Some of them would be wrong. Some of them would cause harm no one would talk about. I could not stop all of that. But somewhere, in a small room with folding chairs and burnt coffee, someone would hear the truth before they crossed their own line. Someone would pause. Someone would choose differently. That was enough. I did not rebuild what I lost. I built something else, something honest. And in the end, that was the only thing I was ever trying to keep.